The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi, and welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. I am Tony Palmeri, sitting in for Cheryl Hentz. And the reason I'm sitting in for Cheryl is because we're going to be analyzing the election results tonight. Cheryl was in the race, and she prefers not to be in on the discussions of that race. And so with me here today are two Eye on Oshkosh, I don't know if I call them regulars, but they've been here before. On my left is Dr. James Simmons. He's the chair of the Department of Political Science at UW-Oshkosh, author of many scholarly and popular books, and very well known for his views on local, state, and national politics. And on my right is Dan Rylance. Dan is a former legislator in North Dakota. He was the editor of a newspaper in North Dakota and has also been very outspoken on local politics. Dan actually also has been working at Webster Stanley Middle School. Elementary school in an AmeriCorps type position, right?
Vista for a while.
Vista. And they are producing, if we can get a shot of this, the Webster Wave. This is produced by fifth graders, fourth and fifth graders?
Fourth and fifth graders.
All right. Absolutely incredible. And it will be distributed at the public library and some other locations.
Right. The issue came out yesterday.
Yeah, unbelievable. You will not believe the quality of writing of fourth and fifth graders, so a very worthwhile project.
We're proud of them.
All right. Thank you both for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's talk about all the races on April 5th, and why don't we start off with the mayor's race. For the first time in about 50 years, citizens had a chance to vote for mayor, and Bill Castle defeated Paul Esslinger by 53% to 47%. Jim Simmons, what happened here?
All things considering, a relatively close contest, given the disparity of the spending in the race, given the kind of reportage in the local media.
What was the disparity in spending?
Well, we don't know yet, but the preliminary was something like 10,000 to not quite 3,000. You don't know what the final reports are going to show. Mm-hmm. And then there was, of course, all the independent spending by Political Action Committee.
Like Forward Oshkosh?
Forward Oshkosh. Independent spending by Progress Oshkosh, which, ranked various policy positions close to Castle. And
so the independent spending was weighted heavily in favor of Castle?
It seems so.
Okay. Dan, what's your take on that election?
I think money matters is a variable that probably will go through many of these elections we talk about. Just as a preliminary comment, I've lived in this town since '67, and this election by far was the most interesting, and for a number of reasons. A lot of candidates for council, a mayor's race, a contested race for county executive. So from a person living here just 8 years, this election had more to it than any of the previous ones.
Oh yeah. Well, why do you think ultimately Castle won? Was it the money?
Oh, I think money was very important.
It allowed him to get more literature out, more advertising.
I don't think Esslinger did a lot of campaigning and advertising. So I mean, as far as visibility, although they both had good name identification, clearly Castle, spent more in terms of yard signs and other things than Esslinger did.
Frankly, I thought too that. Paul and his slate of candidates, and I think you can call it that, didn't work quite as hard. You can overcome in a city the size of Oshkosh disparities in funding, but you've got to have a grassroots organization, you've got to go to the doors. I think that even with all of that, you saw Castle and Bain attending more hearings, putting more effort into the campaign, really making it clear that they wanted to be holding those offices, and Cheryl and Joe Youngworth tended to treat the election much the way an election is normally held in Oshkosh.
Right.
You hold up a few forums, League of Women Voters put up a few yard signs, and hope the voters will choose correctly.
Now the mayor's race is a nonpartisan race, but if you look at the districts, quite a few of the districts that would have went for John Kerry in November of 2004 actually went for Esslinger, is that right?
Sure, it's hard to just look at the spatial analysis and know how individual voters voted, but you look at West Haven, you look at the lakefront, you look at the places where Castle really carried his big margin, those were all Bush areas. I've got the feeling that Esslinger did well among low to middle income working class and service workers living in modest homes
like
in
the
Oshkosh.
Reagan Democrats.
And probably not so well among Democrats who are, teachers. And
right, the white collars.
Right,
yeah.
the professional
Right.
group.
Because it seems like there's an element of the Democratic Party that just can't stand Esslinger, and yet it strikes me as the problem with the Democratic Party nationally has been the inability to connect with this group. Is that fair?
Huge fall off in the National Democratic Party among working class voters, among people with modest income. The idea of the Democratic Party, really the party of the working man,
right.
Not quite so much in most recent elections.
No, and yet they can try as hard as they want to befriend the Bill Castle element, but Bill is a hardcore Republican.
Well, I think, I don't know that it's that so much as the fact that the social conservatism of many of the working class voters and people like Paul just turns them off, because the party is more and more associated with the values of upper middle class professionals on identity politics, on gender and race.
Okay. Dan, we had a 22% voter turnout in this race. Now my understanding is that's 22% of registered voters.
Yeah.
Now, some
That's
people...
high.
Well, see...
I mean, high for Oshkosh for local elections.
Okay, but it's still disgraceful, isn't it?
It's 75%, more than 75% didn't vote.
How would you account for that? Do people not perceive that this is important? I mean, I thought this was the most important election we've had around here in at least 10 to 15 years.
Absolutely.
So for 75% of the registered voters, it just was another day, it didn't matter.
Yeah, another day at the bank.
The problem for a candidate like Paul Esslinger is that many of the people who really feel that the city is not accountable, that it's not responsive to people like them, the reaction is not to go out and vote. It's to complain about the city and to avoid elections.
Right.
Just the general feeling that even if you were to participate and elect whoever you favor, nothing would change.
That's right.
I mean, Esslinger really needed the South Side. If you look at some of those South Side districts, I guess District 11 would be a South Side district. Is that right? In Ward 22, 1,495 people registered to vote, but 324 actually voted on April 5th. Ward 21, 905 registered, 225 voted. You're not going to win an election with those kind of numbers.
Well, you look at the people who tend to be most turned off, and that's younger voters. So you go to the campus and you find that the voting was actually down from the primary from 190 to about 150.
District, Ward, here's the student. I don't want to pick on the students because I love the students. I'm a professor. But Ward 14, District 7, 2,600 registered voters, 76 voted.
Right.
Ward 13, District 7, 3,300 registered voters, 74 voted.
Right. So I worked that poll. There was 150 votes for 13 hours.
Yeah, you guys were out of there by 8:05, weren't you?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, gee. So Jim, as a political scientist, are these kinds of nonpartisan spring elections, just by their very nature, they're not high turnout elections?
Well, Tony, you're always fond of the progressives, but one of the things the progressives did that undercut responsiveness of local government is to create nonpartisan elections and elections which were not in sequence with national elections. Not to mention the at-large system and the other features of progressivism that tended to depress voter turnout.
Yeah, bad move.
Plus you had two elections for these races this year. You had a primary in February and another, that's two they have to go out to vote for.
Too many elections?
Too many elections.
All right, so let's talk about the Common Council race. So now we've got Meredith Sharman, who was the top vote getter. Brian Bain. Now this is interesting. These were two people who had never run for office before.
Correct.
And they're the top two vote getters.
Right.
Shirley Maddox got back in.
Barely.
Barely, so those were the three. Brian Peschel, the incumbent, was voted off. Joe Youngworth, who ran for the second time, he didn't make it. And of course, Cheryl Hentz from Oshkosh didn't make it. Jim, how do you explain Shireman, Bain, and Maddox?
Well, it's pretty clear this was an atypical election because normally name recognition and incumbency would matter a great deal. You wouldn't have to spend all that much money. You know, if you spent $2,000 or $3,000, that would be probably
Right.
4 or 5 times as much as some of the candidates. But in this case, the candidates identified themselves as being the vehicles of particular policies and issues and with a particular agenda for the city, and voters voted that way. Otherwise, how could you explain that an incumbent is the lowest vote getter among the winners and another incumbent just slightly below her? And in terms of name recognition, Joe Youngworth out of the money too.
And yet, Dan, with 22% of the people voting, and really with Meredith Shireman, the only one who actually got more than 50% of the vote, actually, this can't be called a mandate for anything, can it?
No. She's, you know, I think one of her points she made after the election was she was just a soccer mom and that she got vote all over the city. But she also spent more money than, I think in the primary, correct me if I'm wrong, I think she outspent 12 of the 14 candidates in the primary.
Sounds right.
So she was first in the primary and second in the April election. Bain, on the other hand, was sixth in the primary, but he moved to second.
Right.
So, I mean, but again, I think he worked hard.
Well, you know, there's more to this going on. I mean, if you look at the names on the list of Forward Oshkosh, I mean, it was a who's who of Oshkosh, or and even some who don't live in the city. I mean, I did a community power study 4 years ago, and I could have projected nearly all the names on the list of Forward Oshkosh from that study.
Well, who is Forward Oshkosh?
It's the political action committee associated with Progress Oshkosh.
But I mean, are these largely Chamber of Commerce types?
I think it's broader than that. It includes a lot of young professionals. It includes a lot of people who are generally committed to the city as growth machine.
But it seems to be primarily like a white-collar professional type of organization.
Developers, business owners.
So what was their interest in this?
Well, a number of years ago, Clarence Stone identified city regimes, that is, informal governing alliances that emerge from time to time in different cities, relatively stable governing coalitions over particular historical periods. And what this looks like is what Stone called the corporate development regime.
Corporate development regime.
A regime whose coalition promotes the interests of developers, major corporations, big nonprofit institutions, large Main Street merchants. Equity issues slighted for large-scale, expensive downtown projects, commercial research parks,
Tony?
stadiums, universities, big hotels, gentrifications, casinos,
This is the growth
malls.
scheme.
I hope these voters know what they were voting for.
Well, I think they did. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at the places where the vote came,
Sure.
there are people who feel the city is unresponsive because it doesn't provide the kind of city they want to live.
And but Forward Oshkosh was able, it seems to me in a low voter turnout election, whoever is able to get their vote out is going to win. I mean, I think that the so-called cobblestone candidates, Peschel, Youngworth, Hentz, could have easily won this election. I don't think they worked as hard as the Forward Oshkosh.
Well, and this is another kind of regime which is relatively common, and I think that this is embodied in Eslinger and his group, the caretaker maintenance regime, which is a city government that focuses on the provision of routine services both for small business community and average middle class homeowners who fear higher taxes and disruption of established patterns of social interaction.
Right.
Conservative parochial policies favored by groups that the homeowners associations, small merchants, local small developers, and taxpayer alliance. So, I mean, I think you saw basically two different visions of the city.
And you think people actually voted on those visions?
I think they did.
Okay. It
Otherwise,
wasn't then just simply a case of, I want to vote for mayor. I've gotten 4 pieces of literature from Bill Castle. I kind of see Paul Eslinger on television every now and then. I've gotten a lot of contact from Mayor of the Shireman. Brian Bain left me a phone message on my machine, but I got nothing else from these other people. Wasn't it maybe just a case of the people who won were able to get out more?
I think that's part of it.
Regardless of what their agenda was.
But I think there was a rational choice to, all of the growth team won here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was unanimous. Also, every endorsement the Oshkosh Northwestern made.
Both candidates had
too.
a lot of baggage.
Yes.
Which came out during the campaign. The local newspaper was almost a tabloid for all of the negatives about each of the candidates.
Sure.
Responding to all of the interaction on the web blogs. But I don't think that mattered as much. I think that the voters knew when they were going out there what kind of city they wanted.
Well, I think you're wrong when you say almost a tabloid. It was a tabloid. And I'm looking forward to the day when the Webster Wave becomes the main source of election. Will the Webster Wave do it, Dan?
I don't think 4th and 5th graders are going to analyze city elections every 2 years in Oshkosh.
But it won't be a tabloid, we know that. So, on the Common Council elections now, with what we've got now, does that mean something like the Five Rivers Resort, the condo development, is that now a shoo-in?
Well, I'm not sure that the developers are that serious, but yeah, I think the green light is for growth.
They sound serious.
Well, they've tried other places and left. I wouldn't. The money's not on the table yet.
But if they want it, they're going to get it.
Well, normally, if they
I can't imagine this council saying no.
No, I think that Bill Castro will have a very easy job as mayor. This is a 5-1.
I don't think. Can you imagine a council meeting going on longer than 40 minutes?
No. This is going to be, unless the three old grumpy men at the end prolong, get more than 5 minutes each.
I mean, all these candidates have said they're going to ask tough questions. I'm not sure what kind of tough questions are they going to ask? Like, do you want a $10 million TIF district or a $15 million TIF district? You sure you're okay with 15? Maybe we'll make it. I'll see your 20 and I'll make it 25.
Well, they probably will ask tough questions, but probably not on the dais on council night.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean behind the scenes?
Yeah.
Now, both Bain and Shireman did talk somewhat about wanting a more visible city manager.
Yeah.
They wanted him to be more articulate on goals and be more of a mouthpiece. And Shireman, I think on your radio show, Tony, kind of, not precisely, but in general, talked about a more elaborate and sophisticated evaluation of every city employee.
Yeah.
I don't know where that's going to go. And that would probably be more work for the city manager.
I do think they want the city manager to be more aggressive in promoting development. I don't think, despite what was said about how well the Main Street was doing or the riverfront, I think everyone understands that a lot more work needs to be done.
Well, what I had heard that either Forward Oshkosh or Progress Oshkosh was or is upset with Dick Wolank. They think he's not doing a good enough job.
I think that's probably...
All right. So now that the special interest group has essentially their candidates in office, should Wolank be worried at this point?
Well, I think that he needs to become more of an activist as a city manager. I mean, I think that's what the election results...
Isn't he a South Side guy by background?
I think he is, and the issue that drew him out was the extension of 20th Street, which came up. But I think that he became much more accommodationist when he actually was elected to the city council.
Well, if I were him, I might think about going back to the working class roots. Quite frankly, if I were him, I would be worried right now with this council. Because I do think that some of these candidates, even though they were very, very diplomatic in the way they stated their positions, I had the feeling that they're very, very dissatisfied.
Don't you think, though, that a Castle mayorship will be easier on the city manager than an Esslinger mayorship would have been?
Perhaps not. It may be that they're not. I mean, I think many of them are not happy with building inspectors and some of the city employees, and some of these council members could be asking a lot of tough questions and making some demands on city staff.
Jim, now that we know that candidates in this city are willing to spend $4,000 or $5,000 to get elected, maybe more than that. But I mean, I'm talking about for the council seats. I mean, we don't have the final finance reports yet. But now that we know that, people are going to spend tons of money for seats that pay $2,400, right? And no one's doing it for the money, obviously. Isn't this a good argument for districts? Because if you're running at large, and one person is spending $5,000, another one is spending less than $1,000, the person with the $5,000, of course, has an advantage, right? That's just common sense. Wouldn't it be more difficult for the money to play a role in a district? In other words, Bill Castle could not beat Bill Wingren in a small supervisory district.
Well, that's right.
But he can beat Paul Esslinger in an at-large mayor's race.
But you have to remember that Wingren really beat the pavement.
Absolutely, you can do that in the district.
Exactly, and it's even possible in the city. I mean, you recall your assembly races. I mean, one of the things you have to say about the incumbent Underheim is that he really does the doors. He does go to people directly and ask them for their vote and provide services, and they know that he's going to be there.
Right, he gets out there, but he usually outspends his opponents too.
Of course.
That doesn't hurt.
Not that, and the fact that he's an incumbent and can actually do things for voters is a big advantage too.
But don't you think, though, that districts would be a fairer system? At least some districts?
Well, I've always thought so, but yeah. There are problems with districts, of course. There's a possibility of gerrymandering district lines and so on. But by and large, in comparison to other alternatives.
But now, Dan, with this council, I believe now the majority of people on this council would not even have supported electing the mayor.
Absolutely not, including Castle, who was elected mayor.
Right.
Said so many times.
Yeah, right. So any talk of political reform at this point is pretty much dead.
Right, and if they're feeding off of these PAC groups that Jim has just mentioned, they don't want it. They want the city at large. That's where their influence is on a race, not on.
Truthfully, though, I've got the feeling that the various progressive groups would like to see a mayor who is a bit more assertive and more of a booster of the city than Bill Castle. I mean, you know, Bill is, you know, never really shown himself as being a kind of aggressive, very visible or eloquent.
Right. Well, now we got to wait 2 years for that. Right. I mean,
it'll be interesting to see how this mayor evolves as a, you know, I mean,
because Castle essentially said he would be a caretaker. He'd run the
said,
meetings.
Absolutely, no change. No change.
Right. All right. Well, anything else about the council race? I mean, anything that either of you think we can expect from this council? Are we headed for just 6-1 votes?
Well, you know, Sherman and Bain, I'd be interested to see how they vote. I mean, they've made some promises that they're going to ask hard questions, and they're not rubber stamps for this group. I think it'll be interesting to see how they do vote in the next year.
Yeah, we definitely will.
I think I on Oshkosh ought to keep an eye on them.
Yep, I think we will. All right, let's talk about the county executive race. Now, I thought this was the major upset of April 5th. Mark Harris, with 51% of the vote against Jane Vandehei, who had served 2 terms, 8 years. And Dan, what's your explanation for this?
I agree. And almost everyone I talked to said, well, Jane Vandehei is going to win. And I was surprised, to be honest with you. And you know, I don't have the vote tallies, maybe you guys do, on the breakdown between the north and the south of the county. But clearly, you know, that was a close race, and then some of those big Oshkosh precincts came in, and then I think he moved ahead on those. But I was surprised.
I think Harris was almost exactly right about both his strategy and his reasons for victory. Number one, Jane has never won the executive her last 2 elections by a big margin.
No.
4 years ago, she beat someone less known than Harris by less than 800 votes.
And which was Charlene Lowe.
Right.
And I mean, if Charlene had been a stronger candidate, she might have won.
Well, there was a higher turnout. I mean, to be sure, the abysmal turnout you're talking about is awful, but it's usually less in Oshkosh.
Right.
So when you think about that, you could explain almost all the difference by the higher turnout in Oshkosh, which goes overwhelmingly to the Judy Klusmans or the Lows. And then Harris said that he cut into the margin of Vandehei in some of the northern districts. I'm not sure if that's true, but it'd be interesting to look at.
Why was Jane Vandehei, this was true for her entire 8 years, why was she so unpopular in the city of Oshkosh?
Well, this is long-standing. I mean, it precedes Jane Vandehei, and it goes back to the notion that the county board's too large, too inefficient. County does some things that some people would rather not see done. It's responsible for social welfare and so on. There's an elected executive and a large board, which, you know, for reformers who think you need to have small boards and professional administrators, that's been a sticking point.
Dan, what is your assessment of the Vandehei years? I mean, overall, Do you think she was a good county executive?
Remember, Tony, 4 years ago when you were doing the commentary show from UW-O, and you asked me to call all of the supervisors to ask who they were voting for?
Yeah, they couldn't stand
I think
her.
we came up with 25 or 26 who were opposed to her. That says something, doesn't it? Huh?
And I never could figure out if that meant that she was as bad as they said,
Yeah.
or she was very effective,
Yeah.
and she rattled them.
There may be a male-female thing here for some of us.
I think all the supervisors used to love Jack Steinhilber, but Jack didn't do much of anything, did he?
But even under Jack, the county got a lot of criticism. I mean, Jack was an insider. He was a good old boy.
very
But
much
even so, even then, the county took a lot of criticism.
What do you
Perhaps
think about
less Jack personally than the county government.
What do you think about Jane overall? I mean, is history going to show that she, was an effective executive, that she did do good things with this county?
Well, again, it may not show anything because too few people know what county government does and what they're getting for their benefits. So I think there's a lot more superficiality in voting in county elections than there is in the city.
Well, what can we expect from Mark Harris? I mean, during his campaign, he said that Vanda High doesn't know how to do budgeting. She's dipping into the reserves, even though I thought she demonstrated fairly clearly that it wasn't really a dipping into the reserves in the way you normally think of that. So, I mean, do you anticipate him to do much different budgeting?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult for him because he's going to have the same kind of divisions that Vanda Hay had on the county board. I mean, he claimed that he would show up at meetings and sit through them and be more directive. I'm not sure that's true. I think there's a separation between the executive and the legislative branch in the county that probably that won't be as effective as he claimed during the campaign.
Well, he promised he'd do it now.
Well, I'm sure he probably will carry through on his promise.
Yeah.
It'd be a style change.
Yeah.
In what sense?
Just personalities. He'll talk less. His demeanor is sort of calm and non-confrontational. I think you'll see that right away.
So
he's an articulate guy. He is very thoughtful, and
Yep.
I'm sure that he'll give a great deal of scrutiny to the budgets. And I think he'll be more of a hands-on manager too. I mean, Jane was very accessible. You could call her up at any time, and she'd be talking with you for a lengthy period of time. But you always wondered how can a county executive have that much?
do you think the press was unfair to her over the years? I mean, she became unpopular with the Oshkosh Northwestern probably by her second year in office, and then it was fairly unrelenting after that.
To be truthful, I think the Northwestern favored Judy Klusman in the first election and Lowe the second. And, they were both Republicans, and although Harris was a Democrat, I think that Jane's faction within the Republican Party is not a kind of establishment group.
Yeah, the Republican Party is fairly split.
It is, and I think Jane's never been part of the real establishment within that party. I mean, you looked at the names on her list versus the ones who were endorsing Harris, and really clear differences.
Tony, I think the Democrats in the county made a couple of gains. I think both Brian Bain and Mark Harris are pretty well connected with the Winnebago County Democrats, and I think you got to chalk up a couple of victories for them in this election.
And of course, the rumor about Harris has been going on for a long time, is that he really wants to run for Congress.
Right. And he was pretty open on your radio show about that.
Yeah.
He wants to do his 4-year term, but if something became available, he didn't say he was not interested.
Right.
Huh?
Right. Right. And I would guess that especially if Pete tried, once that becomes an open seat,
Sure.
if Pete doesn't run, he would be a very good candidate.
Absolutely.
For that. Anything else on the county executive race at this point? I mean, do you expect any major new initiatives from Mr. Harris?
I think his fiscal hands are tied. I don't think there's
See,
a lot
that's
of flexibility there, do you?
Right.
Huh?
You notice that both referendums won, that that
Yeah, what
Joe
does that
Mayo
mean?
put forward complaining about the unfunded mandates and all of the things that the state pushes off onto the county.
Right.
And there is fiscal restraint because, like the university, what the state is doing is going to make it more and more difficult for anyone as county executive in any county in Wisconsin.
What if the state gives him 20% less in revenue sharing? Then you'll see some things happen.
Yeah, you certainly will. All right, what about the school board? We had 2 incumbents returned, McDermott and Schneider. What was your take on that?
Well, I think the school board race was sort of eclipsed by these other races
Yeah.
this time, because in the
Very
years
much
in the
so.
past they've been very volatile. The incumbents won easily, although if you add up the votes of Wilson and Daggett together, they got more votes than Schneider, who ran, what, 1,500 votes behind McDermott. I guess my big question is, how did Daggett get over 2,000 votes in the school board election? What does that mean?
I have no idea.
Huh?
I mean, I can't explain that vote other than one of those, you know, none of the
Protest?
above, yeah.
Yeah.
What was your take on the school board race? Is it just name recognition, incumbents?
I think in this case it was incumbents winning. I don't think like previous elections where people were upset with plans by the school board for maybe closing schools or changing district lines and so on. I think that's subsided for the moment, which may explain why Snyder was behind McDermott by a significant margin.
Yeah, definitely.
Tony, I would predict Lee Wilson will be a candidate in 2006.
Yeah, I hope he does. I have to say, with all sincerity, he was one of the most impressive political candidates I have ever interviewed. I mean, I did not agree with him on every issue, but he is extremely articulate. I really liked his whole position on how the district needs to start paying more attention to people that want to go on to Ivy League schools rather than playing to the middle.
Most defeated candidates don't show up at a school board meeting the first meeting after they've been beaten, unless they're planning for the future.
Yeah, because you know, usually I get turned off when I interview candidates, right? And he was one of the examples of someone that I didn't. I thought he was very sincere and very passionate about his beliefs. So I hope he does run again.
And Daggett seemed one of the strangest candidates I've ever encountered. I just found that sort of the wild card in this election.
And 2,000 plus votes.
Yeah.
How many seats did he run for?
3.
Yeah. Now it looks like the school board now, it's just not going to change. I mean, it's the same as it's been the last 2 years at least, I would guess.
Right.
So what has been your view of this current school board?
Well, I think McDermott should be given credit for sort of stabilizing leadership on the board. But they're ducking big issues. What happens if you throw the boundary issue on them? Which they, we've got a disparity between the populations of these two high schools, which is growing. Shouldn't they do something about that?
Yeah, they like to put that issue off, don't they?
We have to study it. We have to study it. It's been studied.
Right.
So as long as they stay away from these big issues, I think it'll be continuity on the board. But once they get into these bigger, and a big cut again, another year, pain will come there also.
Well, status quo too, because you have the incumbent Burmaster winning as DPI.
We'll talk about that shortly. But of course, the school board is probably lucky that Doyle is coming up for election next year, because Doyle wants to fully fund the schools.
Or at least has come close to
down in Madison, everything is about getting through the next election cycle.
Right.
And so Doyle has calculated that the best way for him to do that is to fully fund K through 12. So that should be good for our district for at least 2 years, right?
It should.
Yeah. Because down in Madison, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, they have made no strides toward trying to reform the way we fund these schools. Nothing.
Nothing. Now, in fact, that's one of the reasons why the state picked up the 2/3 tab on the schools, was to equalize spending across the schools. Now, they picked up the cost, or at least 2/3 of the cost, but no equalization, or very little.
And the court was only one vote short of throwing that out as unconstitutional.
Right.
And it was the Democrats, you have to remember, that raised the issue, and the Republicans who jumped on it and rode it to victory.
Right, absolutely. So anyway, but the bottom line is I think Doyle will help them get through the next few years.
No guarantee the legislature is going to give him what he wants for education, right?
That's true. That's true. And if we have time later, maybe we'll get into the state budget politics. All right, what about the DPI race? Now, was Underheim the sacrificial lamb for the Republican? I mean, this is what upset me. That's supposed to be a nonpartisan office, and yet the Republicans and Democrats clearly have made that a partisan office now.
It's been a partisan.
It's been for a while.
For a while.
Right. Yeah. Well, has there been a Republican in there? I
don't think so. Not recently.
Not recently.
Yeah.
Right.
But the fact was that it wasn't as controversial this time around as it was the last two election when Cross.
Yeah, Linda Cross.
I mean, because there was more in this campaign. Underheim was simply playing the card that, you can't throw money at schools and make them better, that we ought to introduce technology in the schools to save money. Probably cost more than it actually saved, but conservative fiscal ideas, but Cross raised issues of social conservatism, family values and prayer and so on. So DPI gained national attention with a lot of money coming into the state from groups across the country who saw her as the kind of social conservative who really changed the schools with regard to prayer, basics, and so on.
You think the Republicans thought that Greg had a chance to win that race?
No.
So he was just what? He was the sacrificial.
This was a Tabor feeler.
What do you mean?
He basically ran on supporting Tabor. This is and against the Doyle plan for education.
See, my theory is they saw what happened to Mary Panzer, who was the Senate Majority Leader in Madison. She got defeated by Glenn Grothman, who's a very conservative Republican, on Tabor. That was the issue. And I thought that John Gard calculated that we could do the same thing to Burmaster. And was she too strong? Do people not care about April elections? I mean, all of the above.
I found it hard to understand why Greg entered the race. I mean, he's a very savvy politician, I think, and I don't see what the payoff is. He must have known he couldn't win this race. At most, he could make it close. He could raise some issues, and there's no Republican governor. And unless Green or one of the others is elected, there's no appointed position that Greg has to fall back on in return for his playing the good soldier.
Yeah. So he probably would have been better off not running for it then.
Well, we'll see. There may be something that we don't know about.
Is that office now, you said it's been partisan for a while, but is that office now permanently tarnished? I mean, the race was more partisan this time, as I recall, than ever before.
I think it's a fossil. I think it shouldn't be an elective office. Education has become a major part of state budget. Let the governor who wins appoint his head of commissioner of education and let it change with administration.
To show you how partisan that office has been for as long as you can remember, it was the head of DPI who challenged the universities, in particular faculty, and the Board of Regents that responded to DPI with the idea of sifting and winnowing of ideas. So,
okay, so it has been.
That's right.
Actually, the DPI, the superintendent is a member of the Board of Regents by virtue of being in that position.
This is a very old constitutional office.
Yeah.
The content of the curriculum in public schools frequently does become highly partisan and contested.
Right. Well, let's move on to the judges race. We had our circuit court judge race, Scott Wolt against Dan Bissett, and Wolt won that race 62% to 38%. Any surprise there?
Bissett was bisected. He didn't do very well. I mean, for all of his negative campaigning, I think it didn't work. That was really all he had to offer, and I think voters said no to negative campaigning.
Was it a negative campaign to say that Wolt, nice guy, had given these contributions to Doyle and he gets the appointment? Is that negative?
Well, the same issue came up in Outagamie County, where former Deputy Prosecutor Brad Preby lost, and
badly.
That was lost badly, and there the race was even more negative, and the association with Governor Doyle as an appointment hurt him much more than Wolt. So campaign may have had some little negativity, and there were other things going on that, you know, the people talking about corruption with Wolt, but I didn't quite hear the stories about what that corruption involved.
Right.
He also, I think, has made an impressive start as a judge. He had some positive things going for him.
But part of it, too, the few things you saw, and remember that judge races are not highly visible to most of us. I just think that Wolt had a much better TV personality. More pleasant, smiling, more appealing to the audience, I think.
Kind of a compassionate person.
I think so.
Are circuit court judges elected all over the country?
No.
Okay, in some places they are appointed?
That's right, but you know, most states are more like us than not.
Okay, because I'm always frustrated interviewing judge candidates because they essentially never want to talk about anything.
They're the secret third branch
you
of
know,
government.
you know, I may have to rule on that. I may have to vote on that.
Sure.
So what do you vote on?
Well, what you saw. I mean, you know, the fairness, equity. You know, you've created courts that do various things that go beyond what you normally do. You change the procedures to make them more efficient, less expensive.
course, after what we've been through, Dan, with Paulus in this county, it's going to take a long, long time for the judicial system to get back in good graces, don't you think?
That's true, sure.
And
I think just law enforcement and DA work in this county will be under scrutiny for some time as a result of that.
There may have been a little bit of that with Brad Priebe losing his race. I mean, just shifting one county may not be enough.
There's one Paulus figure left, I think, has to come up for election next time, who's a judge.
who's that?
And I can't think of his last name.
Oh, Gritton.
Yes.
Oh, is he up next year?
Well, he should be up pretty soon, I think. You know, he's clearly identified with Paulus.
Oh yeah, he was Paulus's candidate.
Yep.
when he ran, and I think the memory of it will still be fresh enough.
Well, one thing, even if our memory is not, the local newspaper is not giving up in the story.
Paulus
even
memory
though
is there pretty strong.
Yeah.
They didn't cover it while it was happening.
But they love it now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. All right. We had a couple of referendum questions. One was a state referendum on the ballot that passed by 75% to 25%, which now will expand the terms of office. So the district attorney now gets 4 years instead of 2. I was in that 25% that voted against this. The argument that was being made was, well, essentially it's too much trouble to have to campaign every 2 years. Well, then why only have a 4-year term? Why not make it an 8-year term? Whereas the Madison Capital Times said, why have elections at all then? And I also thought in this county, after what we'd been through with Paulus, think about it. If he had been elected to a 4-year term in 2000, he would have been in until 2004.
But Tony, he fooled the voters here for what, 15, 20 years?
On 2-year terms.
On 2-year terms, which was more often.
I think I agree. In fact, making a term a 4-year term gives the office more weight. Yeah. You know the election is important because, you know, with a 2-year term, they're only going to be there 2, and you'll have a shot at them shortly. 4 years, that's a more serious vote.
But when in the case of Paulus, someone comes out as a whistleblower, Jelinski.
Okay.
And the guy's coming up for election relatively soon. Suppose Jelinski had come out in 2001 with his complaints, and Paulus isn't there till 2004. You know, I mean, Jim, and this goes back to the progressive era, right? The idea of 2-year terms was it keeps people closer to the people. They'll have to be accountable.
Actually,
right?
the progressives favored longer terms.
Did they? Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, the progressives tended to take on the idea of Jeffersonian democracy, the long ballot, everyone elected, short terms, big councils.
Well, who supported the 2-year terms?
Actually, conservatives, in the sense that they favored the status quo, you know, the current institutions which they dominated. The political machines favored that because, you know, if you can control turnout and if machines are pushing immigrants or average people to the voting booth, then and if they're not highly visible offices.
Because the same arguments that were made to make these county terms 4 years could be said for the U.S. Congress. Why have them run every 2 years?
Oh, there's a difference. It is the people's house, and the lower house is to be closer to the people and have closer elections. These aren't legislative positions.
Well, the main one I'm concerned about is the DA. I mean, I agree with you on Register of Deeds. And
yeah. I don't know whether they should even be elected positions. Huh?
I don't think they should either.
No.
Yeah. And now that goes back to the progressive era, or no?
That's right. Progressives wanted to eliminate all of these elective positions, particularly for basically administrative posts, and replace them with appointed positions.
Okay. All right. All right. We had 2 county referendum questions saying that the state should pick up the tab for human services and for, I can't remember what the other question was about, but these both passed by overwhelming margins. Is that just meaningless?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, essentially the counties wanted to make a statement that, you know, the state was putting more and more of a burden on them, telling them what it was they had to do, and without providing the necessary funding.
What do you think John Gard will do with those when he gets them?
Stack them up and use them as like doormats or something, or you know.
He never reads them.
Yeah. I mean, just completely. It was like the campaign finance referendum they had a few years ago, right?
They're meaningless.
Yeah, just so. Why even bother? So, what would you guys say about this election year in general? I mean, do you think we'll ever have in the city of Oshkosh a situation again where we get 14 primary candidates?
I don't know about the number of candidates. But I could imagine not next year, but perhaps the following year when the mayor's office is up again to to see a race very similar to this one?
You think this was a...
I think it was a defining moment, but whether it'll be 10 years of continuity with no more changes, it's too early to tell. One thing that upset me is I really think we need ballot reform. I do not think it's fair, particularly in a primary where there are 14 candidates locked into one position in the ballot in all voting areas in Oshkosh. They could rotate the names, and they do that very often in many other places.
Yeah. Well, we need many other types of election reforms, don't we?
Yeah. Well, we have a pretty good voting system. The machine is an excellent machine. I think the ballot is unfair.
Yeah. Well, I also think that there's too much on the ballot. I mean, think about all you had to vote for this time. You know, between the judge, the council, and all that. I mean, doesn't there get a point where there's just too much?
Have you seen a California or Florida?
Yeah, it's terrible.
This is
Washington
pretty short.
or Oregon with all the initiatives, this was a short.
Well, I mean, but I have had students mostly, but I think other people in the community feel the same way, that they believe that they're not going to know what to do when they get in there. There's too much there. I've never seen these names before. Now I'm going to go...
Truthfully, though, there was more information available on this election than at any time in memory. Yeah. And it was available in so many forms. I mean, that was a major problem that Stu Rickman had of the Northwestern, is that there was a lot of competition with the mainstream media that you know, provided information that you...
Ton of information. Maybe information overload. I am...
Some of it was even true.
Yeah. I've heard that in some countries it is against the law not to vote. You have to vote as a...
There's some countries where
voting
is mandatory. A small fine.
Right. Don't you think it's time to move toward that in the United States? I mean, here, these 22% elections, no mandate. I don't know how a council can govern without a mandate, because the moment they try and do something big ticket, all of a sudden we'll find out where the mandate really is.
You know, I think a citizen forum on how to increase voter turnout would really be a good idea. I think the Tuesday is a negative.
Why not make it legal? Why not make it against the law not to vote? I mean, I was telling my class this the other day. I said, you know, if I have ice in front of my house, they can force me to chip that ice on the basis that I might kill myself or kill someone else. I mean, speaking metaphorically, isn't the entire nation slipping on ice with these low voter turnouts? And is it really the heavy-handed approach of government to force people to go out and vote?
Well, these countries have both a radical as well as a conservative tradition. So the conservative tradition is that voting is both an obligation and a duty as well as a right. So that's why it's possible to impose fines on those things we wouldn't even consider here. But I think that multiple political parties, campaigning that tends to be issue-oriented, strong, responsible political parties, unions, multiple groups,
Sunday voting,
all of those
kinds
of things.
Well, because,
short campaigns.
Okay, because here's what I'm seeing happening now. The establishment political parties have now gotten very sophisticated at locating who did vote. They know who votes in the community. They know the households that vote. So increasingly, they're focusing only on those people. The people who don't vote are simply being, I mean, for example, if you look at the statistics coming out of Oshkosh in this past election, the numbers on it, they've got columns of how many people voted, how many new registrations were there prior to the election. There were 8 new registrations prior to this election. That means that no one is out there registering voters.
But there were hundreds of new registrations before the 2004 presidential election.
Right, but what I'm saying is political organizations, whether they're parties or someone else, one of their tasks probably ought to be to regularly go after people to register.
And in this environment, you know, it's much more easy to identify voters, to contact, to network. And there's an advantage to those who do. And that was another feature of this campaign, where the winning group did those things, and the losing group didn't do them and didn't even know about many of them.
What were the winning group, that's using the label progressive development and all that, what was this group so afraid of the other group? Like the prospect of an Esslinger as mayor and these so-called cobblestone candidates seem to really send fear a lot of these folks.
Well, it's hard
Do
to...
they honestly think that development in the city would shut down?
It's hard to see from the actual voting record, because if you look at the votes,
Yeah.
it wasn't always 5-2, and in fact, Paul frequently voted for development. And in some of the things where he voted against it was relatively superficial, colored cement,
Yeah.
some lights, and so on. Potties at the, you know. But again, it probably was a feeling that if Esslinger did become mayor, that feeling a mandate, he might become more aggressive in his stance on development.
Okay. There actually is one issue I wanted to raise with both of you, and it's dealing with development. And it's this issue of the no-bid contract in which we had an opinion from the Attorney General's office that said that essentially the city broke the law. All right. Now, the city attorney is arguing that, well, the Attorney General's opinion is just an opinion. Now, what is the Attorney General's opinion? Is it just an opinion?
It has the effect of law.
Absolutely. In absence of law, it's law.
Unless reversed by a judge in a
That's right.
courtroom decision.
Okay, so what does that mean? So in the city just ignoring that opinion?
Well, I can recall a number of years back when I was involved in the effort to change the form of government, the city attorney said the same thing about the state elections board attorney. Just his opinion, we can ignore it and force us to take action.
Mr. Kraft is also very selective at when he accepts an Attorney General's opinion and when he doesn't. Remember that one on the open meetings thing that he spent an hour explaining to them how this opinion, they can't do this? Now they're scared to talk to each other going up the elevator because of this opinion.
Right.
Well, he accepted that opinion,
His
didn't
sensitivity is extremely selective, I've noticed over the years.
Yeah, so you're telling us that the Attorney General's opinion has the force of law.
In any state where there's an absence of law, the Attorney General's opinion is law unless challenged in court or changed by the legislature.
I mean, student opinion surveys on campus, Attorney General's opinion, and if there's an open record request, we have to respond, and if we don't.
So the city of Oshkosh then is currently sitting in violation of the law.
I think so.
Yeah, and so until a citizen steps forward and files lawsuit against the city.
Well, remember that that's unlikely to happen
Yeah.
unless a citizen has deep pockets and has
Right.
a real interest in reversing the attorney's opinion.
Yeah.
Okay, the city's placing a lot of hope in the amphitheater to be a kind. The way they're talking about it, like it'll be a kind of anchor for downtown. Do you expect that kind of?
Too early to tell. I don't think big name entertainment will play well in Oshkosh. If that's their game plan, I think they could be surprised.
I just came back from Chicago last week, and I saw Millennium Park, and it works incredibly well there. I mean, I could not imagine that around the band shell and around the art down there, people of different races, different income levels, and so on, all converging on a part of Chicago where I never saw a warm body after 6 o'clock. So it can happen. Will it happen in Oshkosh? On the other hand, you know, the city really hasn't supported a lot of those kinds
What I don't
of
understand is why the city gave a gift away to PMI. I still don't understand why this is a public gift. This is a public resource. Is this a national thing where a city gives away its resources? Because now instead of getting 100% of the proceeds to the city for our gift, we now get, is it 30% from PMI or 10% from PMI?
I think increasingly cities have turned over these operations to professional
Because I mean,
promoters.
Waterfest showed us how to do these things. You get volunteer groups to serve the beer and the hot dogs. That's easy. We can. I think as a city we can handle that. I would think. And
well, it's too bad. If you wanted a kind of middle-class event where people are out on their boats and it's relatively cheap and the entertainment is inexpensive, then you've probably lost that.
Yeah.
What you've gained is less to be seen.
All right. What do you guys think about what's going on in Madison? We've got Doyle coming up for election in 2006. Is he in trouble? What do you think? I think he's in big trouble.
I think we don't know yet. It's not clear to me because Scott Walker and Congressman Green, Doyle's made it really difficult. He talks, you know, protecting local taxpayers and putting on freezes. He takes away their tax issues. He talks about efficiencies. I mean, he acts as governor, or at least talks as governor, as a Republican.
But Dan, don't you think that Democrats at the grassroots level tend to be more liberal? And Doyle doesn't really govern as a liberal. He's like Wisconsin Manufacturers. Jim Beacon of Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce has said that we get more from Doyle than we would have ever dreamed of.
On the other hand, what's the alternative for a Democrat in Wisconsin in 2006, other than to support Jim Doyle?
Or to stay home.
Or to stay home. I think there's still a shot that he might be challenged in the primary.
You know, Mark Green ran on Congress to be a fiscal conservative, and I'd like to see his spending bill since he's been there.
So anyway, we have notorious budget cycles in Wisconsin that go on endlessly. Is that going to happen this year?
Undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly. I mean, there's going to be posturing through most of the summer. It could be that we're not going to resolve it until sometime in the fall.
And see, what is this? I mean, what is the big hang-up? What is the main thing they're disagreeing with?
They're really difficult choices. I mean, if you've locked yourself into no new taxes, and even with regard to fees and charges, you can't go very far without being criticized. And given healthcare costs, the prisons that we have to manage, the cost of public schools.
Medicare is killing state government. It's the single largest increase in every state in the union.
But wouldn't you think that these folks could get together and hash out a solution to this? This is pure partisanship, correct?
And in state legislatures, Congress, city councils becoming increasingly partisan to the point where people can't even speak with each other. It's not a question that you're wrong and I disagree and this is why. But you're a bad person. And
and so this could go on forever. I mean, didn't the Joint Finance Committee already say that they're basically throwing out Doyle's budget?
They're going to rewrite the executive budget.
They said.
So in other words, they're basically saying what Doyle gave us is worthless.
Not going to take it.
But they're boxed in. There aren't a lot of alternatives to what the governor offered to them.
Because once you they've all taken taxes off the table, right? So once taxes are off the table,
and they can pass their own budget, Tony, and Doyle can veto it and send his budget back.
What a mess. But I think low voter turnouts help contribute to this mess, so maybe we all are at fault. I want to thank Jim Simmons and Dan Rylance for being here. For more information about UW-Oshkosh, go to our website, UW-Oshkosh.com, and you can go to my website for more information, TonyPalmeri.com. For Jim Simmons and Dan Rylance, I'm Tony Palmeri, hoping you'll join us again next time for another edition of UW-Oshkosh. Take care.